On UpFront today, we'll debate why Turkey is rerunning a major election. But first, I'll challenge Nobel Peace Laureate and former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf on corruption, nepotism, and the prosecution of war crimes. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, thank you for joining me on UpFront. It's been more than a year since you left office as President of Liberia. You came into power off the back of a peace deal that followed decades of war and violence and coups. You ended your mandate with Liberia's first successful democratic transition in 73 years. You're the first woman to lead an African nation, a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And yet some might say you've been more popular abroad than you have been at home. What do you say to them?
Well, you know, I think if one really went around the country, where I spent a lot of time going into rural areas, being able to work with farmers and rural women and traders, and, you know, I found that I was very well connected with them. But also, if in the city, some of the positions I took were maybe not popular, then that's fine. But I also know that I had to be out there in the global community, being able to mobilize the support for Liberia, being able to restore Liberia's creditworthiness, being able to make sure that the partnership that we needed, you know, was put in place to enable us to achieve our development goals. I'm very happy with what I was able to do.
When you became president in 2005, you pledged a war on corruption. You called it, quote, a national cancer and, quote, public enemy number one. But then you yourself were hit with a variety of scandals, your government, and you later said you, quote, underestimated the cultural roots of corruption. But surely Liberian culture isn't to blame for corruption. Liberian politicians, such as yourself and others, are to blame for corruption.
Well, let me tell you, politicians are part of the culture. Politicians are part of the value system.
But it sounds like you're blaming the public, the country, for the actions of politicians.
I'm not blaming anybody. No. I think you're just talking without listening. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying dependency, dishonesty came part of the Liberian culture over the many years of deprivation. The institutions to fight corruption were not there.
You mentioned the institutions, and yet you did have an independent corruption watchdog, the General Auditing Commission, which found 20 government ministers, accused 20 government ministers of corruption, and you failed to prosecute any of them. Why?
Well, let me tell you something. All of those reports were sent to our Liberia Anti-Corruption Agency. They were also sent to our legislature. We organized a particular unit in the presidency to be able to look at all of those cases and to be able to send them forward to the Ministry of Justice wherever they thought prosecution was necessary.
So why weren't they prosecuted?
Well, because our system is like that. If you want to really understand Liberia, you need to dig a little bit deeper. You need to understand our culture, our values, our systems. And the way to tackle it is not always to just make a whole lot of noise about it, but to quietly build those institutions that are going to be long-lasting.
What is it about your country's institutions and values and culture that led you to appoint 3 of your sons and your sister to top government positions? Something that led to your fellow Liberian Nobel Peace Laureate, Lema Bowie, to resign from her post as head of Liberia's Peace and Reconciliation Commission. Does she not understand Liberian culture or institutions?
No. Let's put it this way. First of all, when I took office, if you're talking about one of my sons was always in place a couple of administrations before I took place, and I didn't fire him. Yes, I didn't think it was necessary to do so. If you're talking about the others where I needed a specialized skill to be able to achieve our objective of trying to mobilize the resources to tackle our major development programs, that's what I did. And frankly, will you please look around today at some other countries that have found themselves perhaps in similar position? and have been able to put in place those particular
Which
relatives
countries?
close to them
Which
whom
countries
they
are
feel they
those?
could trust. I'll leave that to you to do your research on.
Well, I've done my research. The British Prime Minister hasn't appointed any
But
family
then
members.
then
The Canadian Prime Minister hasn't appointed any family members. The French President hasn't appointed any family members. The German Chancellor hasn't appointed any family members. I could
Well,
keep going,
good
Ellen
for
Johnson
them.
Sirleaf.
Good for them, is that all?
Well, you were
Good for
saying,
them,
look
is
at other
that all?
countries. I'm saying it's not a common practice for presidents or prime ministers, certainly not in democratic nations, to appoint a bunch of family members to run various institutions.
Well, look, let me put it this way. We're really gone beyond this now. You know, let's deal with the real issues of Liberia. Let's
okay.
deal with how we can help this country to succeed.
You say let's deal with Liberia's real issues.
No.
You said you appointed family members for specialized skill sets. Your son, Robert Sirleaf, was appointed chairman of Liberia's national oil company. That company went bankrupt and 30 to 40 million US dollars disappeared. What special skill set did he bring to national oil company?
No. First of all, let me just say, what you just said is a blatant lie. L-I-E, lie. You go look at the records. There is nothing about that company going bankrupt.
So there were no problems at all at National Oil Company?
The National Oil Company ran into because the two companies that were trying to exploit for oil, ExxonMobil and Chevron, could not find oil. They pulled out, and that meant that this company could not continue. It's as simple as that. And the record is clear on
How
that.
about the Liberia's central bank? You appointed your son Charles Sirleaf as deputy governor there. You suspended him. You suspended him for failing to declare his assets. And 2 months ago, he was ordered to be held in jail while awaiting trial for having unlawfully printed local currency worth tens of millions of US dollars. Did you know he was doing that?
Well, I didn't know you wanted to have an interview just to come out with outrageous statements. I mean, if that was so,
I'm confused. Was he not?
Should never, no. I thought you.
Hold on, has he not been held in jail? Is that wrong? Has he not been held in jail?
True. That is not true. That is not true. He was unjustifiably, illegally charged. But anyway,
so he was charged. I mean, that's your opinion. You're his mother. Obviously, you're not going to agree with the charges. I'm just asking you to comment on him being held for trial. You're saying that didn't happen. Please.
No, you're not. No. What you're trying to do is showmanship now. That's what you're trying to do. We don't need that. We need to have a civil exchange.
I'm very civil. I asked a very simple question. You accuse me of making up things. I haven't accused you of anything. I simply asked, your son has been ordered to be held in jail while awaiting trial for having unlawfully printed local currency worth tens of millions of dollars. What's your reaction to that? There's nothing uncivil about that question.
Look, our system requires that when we have a case under the jurisdiction of the court, we're not supposed to talk about it until that matter is settled by the courts. So you're trying to make me do things that are not right and not legal. Please don't do that.
Okay, how about what happened on your watch? You suspended him for failing to declare his assets. Am I lying about that as well?
Oh, I did what I felt I had to do. You have to realize how I ran the government.
That's what we tried to work out here. That's what our viewers want to know. How did you run the government? You appointed family members, suspended some of them. Just wondering how that works.
Oh, well, I don't think you want a conversation.
I do. I don't think you want a conversation because I'm asking questions that are very legitimate questions. I would ask any former president on this show about corruption allegations on their watch. The fact that they happen to be your children is neither here nor there.
You're right.
So you don't want to comment on anything about corruption. Okay. One of the other things critics line up against you for, you're criticized is for your former support of Charles Taylor, your predecessor, who's of course a convicted war criminal. In 2009, you formally apologized for having stood behind him. That same year, the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission made a set of recommendations saying that a compensation scheme should be created, a dedicated war crimes court should be set up. You never took action on those things. Why not?
We have moved beyond the Charles Taylor story. We have moved beyond all of those bad things that characterize our country. Liberia needs peace. Liberia needs civility. Liberia needs to claim a future that's devoid of all of those things that have kept us down, that have divided us, that has created problems for us. Well,
isn't that what truth and
people
reconciliation
out
is
there,
for, to get past division?
Truth and reconciliation has been gone to the courts. It's left the courts. It has transformed into a palaver hut. That process has started, the process of contrition and forgiveness. All of that has started, and so I don't
But
care
you ignored
what
the actual
say.
Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, which also accused you of financing and forming, quote, the warring factions in Liberia's civil wars. The report said that people, including yourself, should be banned from occupying public office for 30 years.
Really? But then maybe you're not up to date on what's happening in our country. Maybe you forget that after that came out, I won 2 elections.
Because you ignored the recommendation that said you shouldn't be allowed to run for office.
No. That went to court. You see, you don't have enough information for the things you say.
Okay.
That's really unfortunate.
Okay.
This matter went to the courts. I didn't put it there. It went up to our Supreme Court, and a decision was taken. You cannot, this body did not have the legal powers to be able to judge people without giving them right of self-defense. It wasn't my case, it was somebody else's case. If you just take a little bit of time to understand the truth and the facts, then you won't have to say some of the things you say.
Okay. It's not true then that the recommendation was for people not to run for office for 30 years. I just made that up.
Well, again, you totally missed the point.
Okay. We'll have to agree and disagree what the report says. People can look it up. One last question. You're one of the few African leaders to have led a peaceful democratic transition. When you look at the state of democracy in some other African nations and see how so many others, Libya, Zimbabwe, others, have failed to do the same, have had repeatedly contested elections, what's your advice to those other African countries, those other African leaders?
I think Africa is on the right track. When it comes to democracy, I think what we need is to make stronger institutions that will ensure that democracy is implemented, will ensure that participation of all citizens in societies are enhanced through their active collaboration to be able to achieve development goals. There may be a lot of those that take away from the successes we've had, from the progress we have, but I think the record is clear, the evidence is right there to see.
Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
I'm not sure if I thank you, but let's say I'm glad it's over.
Back in March, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's ruling Justice and Development Party, or AK Party, suffered surprising losses in local elections across Turkey, including in Istanbul and Ankara for the first time in almost 20 years. But the Turkish president refused to concede, and earlier this month, the country's High Election Council announced a rerun of the Istanbul mayoral election to be held on June 23rd. So, is this just the latest step on the road to Turkish autocracy, or is Erdogan, as his supporters say, just protecting the integrity of the election process? Joining me to debate this from Istanbul, Harun Armagan, a senior member of the AK Party and its former vice deputy chairman for human rights, and Mustafa Akyol, senior fellow at the Cato Institute and contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Harun, your party suffered significant losses in the local elections in March, including in Istanbul, where your president used to be the mayor. In a democracy, many would say you're supposed to respect the election result, not demand multiple recounts, and then have a rerun of the whole election just because your candidate didn't win.
Oh, Matty, you're just repeating the opposition accusations, which are not true. The election is going to rerun because there's an independent body, electoral commission, made a decision to go to a rerun for 2 reasons. Because number 1 is that there were unauthorized people appointed as ballot box officers. Number 2, there were irregularities in vote counting sheets, which in the law clearly says that in these sort of cases, if it's impacting the final result of the election, it goes to a rerun. And it's not the first time. in last municipal elections, there were 14 municipalities that went to rerun for similar reasons.
When you say irregularities, voters in Istanbul didn't just vote for mayor on March 31st. They cast 4 different votes on 4 different pieces of paper that were all put into the same envelope before going into the ballot box. But you're not calling for a rerun of all 4 votes. How come 3 are okay, but one of the votes is irregular? That makes no sense to me.
No, the reason is very simple, Mehdi, if you know the law. Because the difference between the 2 candidates in Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality is very small. If you look at the local municipalities, yes, the irregularities are there, valid for them as well, but they are not impacting the final result because the difference is more.
Okay, Mustafa, it's an independent body calling for a rerun, and they were voting irregularity. What's the problem?
Well, Mehdi, I think it's not that simple. And I should first say this. I'm really sad about what Turkey has become. It's my country. We had a great accomplishment in the early 21st century. We were the shining star of the Muslim world. Unfortunately, it devolved into a grim authoritarian scene in the past 6 years. And a lot of things have gone down, right? Freedom of speech, independent press, a lot of things have gone down already. But at least the elections were there. At least elections were trusted. And now, with the cancellation of the Istanbul elections, unfortunately, now there are question marks about even the accuracy of elections and the legitimacy of elections in Turkey. It will be there. Even former President, former Abdullah Gül, former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who were the people who built this party, said that this is really a bad thing for our democracy. There are independent scholars who don't see any reason, any legitimate reason for the cancellation of the elections. The elections are canceled on a technicality, that there were not there are more than 30,000 ballots in Istanbul. In 200 of them, the people who are the head of the team counting the ballots were not government officials. They didn't used to be government official for decades. This is a new law the AKP brought. The fact that they were not government officials doesn't prove any misdeed there or a miscount. It's just a technicality. And that technicality is not used to cancel other elections across Turkey in which the opposition lost. The only place where opposition won, which is Istanbul, the most important place, is now being canceled. And the ruling party will have its arguments, but other than themselves, nobody in Turkey believes this is fair.
Harun, let me ask you this question. You said earlier that I was just repeating opposition talking points, but it's not just the opposition who have been criticizing the rerun of this election. As Mustafa pointed out, Abdullah Gül, the former president of Turkey, member of your party, the AK party, has said that it casts a shadow over our democracy. Ahmet Davutoğlu, former prime minister, member of your party, has said it's caused our fundamental values to be undermined. Are they also opposition members now?
Look, Mehdi, first of all, these 2 gentlemen are founders of AK Party and very respected senior politicians of our party, and we always note when they do criticism. And yeah, and of course they are open to give their opinions. We hear their opinions. They are able to make their criticism. Indeed, this is what makes AK Party a very democratic party, and they are making this decision based on law, not someone else's comments. I mean, maybe they made an unpopular choice to go to repeat these elections, but at the same time, this was the right decision, according to the law.
Mustafa, to be fair to the AKP, doesn't the fact that they're not demanding reruns in places like Adana or Mesrine, where they also lost to the opposition, doesn't that maybe suggest that there is a genuine objection they have in Istanbul? Because they're not asking for reruns across the board, across the whole country, are they?
No, they're not asking for a rerun in Ankara as well, which they lost.
So
and I think the reason is Istanbul is the most important thing in the scene. Secondly, there's a really close call. I mean, they lost with a very small margin. But the mere fact that elections are rerun in Turkey when the ruling party thinks that they're not helpful, that's a stain on our democracy.
Harun, the fact remains that the AK party did lose to the opposition in other cities throughout Turkey. How do you interpret those losses? Aren't they a referendum on President Erdogan's rule? Aren't they evidence of dissatisfaction from the Turkish public with Erdogan's rule?
No, Mehdi. People have made their decision for the general election last year for President Erdogan with a significant landslide win. So interpreting this municipal election results as a general election would mislead us. It's wrong. That's not correct. And even if you do that, Mehdi, if you look at the general popular vote, AK Party still won 53% general vote in this election.
Can I say something on that, mate?
Briefly, yeah.
There's no doubt that President Erdogan and AKP is still popular in Turkey. There's no doubt about that. The problem is the rest of the country is being demonized by the propaganda machine of the government. In Turkey, the problem we have is a very divisive rhetoric which considers one political line legitimate and the other one is illegal. So, I'm not saying that the President Erdogan is the only person doing this.
Mustafa, to be fair, you're Turkish, I'm not, but to be fair, you're now based in the US, where you're working at a US think tank, you write for the New York Times. Many would say the US is a country where the president delegitimizes the opposition, doesn't treat all sections of society equally. And so many in Turkey, and you've heard this, many in Turkey would say we're being demonized by the West. There's always a reference to a sultan or to an Ottoman Empire. There's a Western media bias against Turkey, against Erdogan.
Yes, I agree
what do you
with
say to that?
There's polarization in the US too, very venomous polarization. And I actually see some of the populist narrative I know from Turkey in the US politics as well.
Yeah.
Today in the hands of, for example, President Trump and some of his supporters. But in the US, there are institutions, there are certain checks and balances. When President Trump passes a Muslim ban, a judge can stop that. In Turkey, that judge would be in trouble himself. In the US, there's independent media. President Trump calls it the enemy of the people, but that term doesn't become an indictment to put a newspaper journalist in jail. In Turkey, the problem is that populist wave, which is now all across the world, is so strong, and it crushed institutions.
Okay, so let's ask.
It left very little in
So let's ask
media.
Harun about that.
So we have a very advanced version of populism in
that's
Turkey.
not true.
In the US, I see other problems as well. In the Western democracies, I see other problems as well.
Harun.
I mean, I think it is not unfair to say the majority of Turkish media has become nothing but a propaganda machine for the government. The 90% of the Turkish media has become like that. I mean, we are all in it.
Let Harun respond.
Absolutely, I disagree with this point, and it makes no sense. Mustafa, where did you get this 90% number? It doesn't reflect the reality, and you very well know that. If you're complaining about the media ownership by a few businessmen, this is a common problem for many countries. For example, Rupert Murdoch in the UK has more than 50% of British media, but you never claim that that becomes a problem for British democracy. And Mustafa's father himself is an opposition journalist in Turkey. He criticized the government several times, and I read him. He's a very respected senior journalist. Are you telling me that Mustafa, your father, is just keeping his position because he never criticized the government?
I
That's
didn't
nonsense.
say
You all know that.
100%
Let's
of
be
the
really
Turkish
serious
media is controlled by the government. I said almost 90% of the media is controlled by the government, and my father is in that 10% right now.
That is
and
wrong.
There are other people, respected people, journalists, yes, who say
That is
respected
wrong.
things.
You very well
If there
know
are
that.
people ever criticizing the government, in that 90%, they lose their job. One of them is Kemal Öztürk, who just was fired from Yeni Şafak. We all know this, let's be honest. In Turkey, media owners, several media owners
you very well
had
know
to
that.
sell their
But
newspapers.
Mustafa, every
Let me finish. In Turkey, people like Murdoch you refer to, they had to sell their newspapers, which were bought by people who were friends with the government, and they transformed those newspapers. They fired the editors, reporters, and columnists who are critical of the government. Let's be honest about this.
We have nothing
Let's
to
be
do with
honest.
that.
You
It
can
has
think
nothing
this
to
is
do
the
with our
people's will.
government.
You can say the nation is winning, but let's be honest. Let's be honest that Hürriyet, Milliyet, all the
point. Let
newspapers
Harun
in
respond.
Turkey have been transformed.
Harun, will you concede any of that, or are you saying there's been no change in all of the world's human rights groups who have pointed out the lack of media freedoms, the media consolidation, the record number of arrests of journalists in Turkey? Turkey now jails more journalists than any other country in the world. Are you denying all of that? We're just imagining all of that?
Oh, come on, Mehdi. These accusations have no basis. First of all, changing ownership in the media is a decision that those businessmen can make. We have nothing to do with those decisions. And also, if I have to be more specific, David Aronovich, for example, he left The Guardian and he went to the Times because his line wasn't really matching with The Guardian's line.
But David Aronovich hasn't been arrested or detained in the UK. You know that many journalists have been arrested and detained in Turkey, so it's not a very good analogy. You know that tens of thousands of people, academics, judges, prosecutors, in the wake of the coup, have all been detained. You know that. Come on. You know that tens of thousands of people have been detained in Turkey. You're not denying that.
I'm very glad you brought it up, Mehdi. I'm very glad you brought it up because I now have chance to clear that up. First of all, in Mustafa's own words, I think in 2018, when he was speaking in Brussels, he said, from his own words, he clearly said that the Gülenist cult, the religious cult, they had a big power on bureaucracy, the military, the police, the judiciary, and media and education. And those guys later on tried to overthrow an elected government. These number of journalists that you give are nonsense. One of them are in jail because he actually published a sex tape of opposition leader. One of them is in jail because he murdered a person.
This whataboutism
not all of
doesn't
them are,
solve Turkey's problems.
Not all
Western
of them
democracy has a lot of problems as well. Turkey has 10 times more of that. And unless we don't even acknowledge that those problems exist, Turkey will not go anywhere better.
Guys, we've run out of time. Harun, Mustafa, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Apologies. That was very lively. And that's our show. Up Front will be back later this year.